I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, just choosing excitement over routine, passion over boredom, freedom over loyalty. I thought my family would understand, that my husband would forgive me like he always did. Then the legal papers arrived, and everyone I loved turned their backs before I could even explain. It started slowly, the kind of thing you tell yourself isn't really happening because you don't want to see where it leads. Damien was just a friendly face at the bar near my school, someone who remembered my drink order and asked about my day when Ethan barely looked up from his laptop anymore. I told myself it was harmless, that a little attention didn't mean anything, that I was allowed to feel interesting after years of being the woman who kept schedules straight and laundry folded while Ethan lived buried in spreadsheets and late-night emails. The first time Damien texted me after hours, I laughed and showed Sophie, saying it was just a joke, just a bartender being friendly, nothing Ethan needed to know about. She smirked and said, I deserved a little fun, that Ethan worked too much anyway, and I let her words settle in my chest, like permission I didn't even realize I was waiting for. The next week, I told Ethan I had a late grading session at school when I was really at Damien's apartment, drinking wine while music played softly from a speaker in the corner. I kept thinking about how Ethan never asked questions anymore, how he trusted me without hesitation, and instead of feeling guilty, I used it as proof that what I was doing didn't matter. If it mattered, wouldn't I feel worse? Wouldn't he notice? That's what I told myself as I texted Sophie later, saying Ethan was distant again, painting myself as the lonely wife while leaving out the part where I was laughing on someone else's couch. By the third week, I was careful with my stories. I told Ethan the principal needed me for evening parent meetings, that Sophie wanted me to help her pick out gifts for our mother's birthday. That grading piled up this time of year. He believed all of it because Ethan believed everything I said, and I twisted that trust into a story where he was the one at fault for not paying more attention. When Sophie asked if I thought things were getting serious with Damien, I said it wasn't like that I just needed to feel alive again. She said maybe Ethan should try harder, that I had been carrying the marriage alone for years, and I let her believe that because it made me sound like the one who had been wronged. But Ethan wasn't as clueless as I wanted to think. One night I came home and found him sitting at the kitchen table, with his laptop closed, just watching me as I set down my bag. He asked if I had eaten already, and I said yes, pretending not to notice the way his eyes lingered on my phone when I turned it face down on the counter. I filled the silence with complaints about work, about grading essays, about anything except where I had really been. He listened without interrupting, nodded like my words were details he needed to remember, and then told me Clara was asleep and he had a late meeting in the morning. I convinced myself his calmness meant he didn't suspect anything. The first hint that someone else had noticed came from a neighbor who mentioned seeing my car downtown more than usual. She said it casually while walking her dog, but the look in her eyes made my stomach twist. That same week, Ethan started coming home earlier, sitting with Clara during dinner, while I claimed to have after-school commitments. I told myself it was just guilt making me paranoid, that no one could actually prove anything. Still, when I saw Ethan collecting the mail one evening and slipping something into his briefcase before I could see what it was, I felt a flicker of unease I tried hard to ignore. At our mother's birthday dinner, Sophie joked that I was the wild one in the family now, always busy, always dressed up, while Ethan sat there quiet and polite across the table. Ruth watched him closely, asking if work was stressful because he looked tired, thinner than usual. He said work was fine and changed the subject, but I noticed how he kept his phone close, how he barely touched his food, how he smiled at Clara but not at me. The next morning I saw him leaving early with a folder under his arm, the same one he used for tax documents and insurance papers. When I asked where he was going, he said he had errands to run before work, nothing important. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice he used when talking to bank tellers or mechanics, the kind of tone that gave nothing away. That weekend I met Damien at his apartment again, ignoring the uneasy feeling that had been growing since the birthday dinner. I told myself Ethan was too passive to do anything even if he suspected, that he hated conflict too much to make this into a real problem. Damien laughed when I said that, poured more wine, told me I worried too much. Maybe I did. Or maybe Ethan was already making plans while I was busy convincing myself he wouldn't. Sunday night ended with Ethan sitting in the living room after Clara went to bed, scrolling through his phone with that same unreadable expression while I tried to make small talk about the week ahead. He nodded at the right moments, asked nothing, offered nothing. It felt like standing on a frozen lake, hearing the faintest cracks beneath the ice, but telling yourself it was safe because you didn't want to believe what was coming. By Monday morning, the tension in the house had shifted into something quieter, heavier, like Ethan had packed away whatever he was feeling and locked it somewhere I couldn't reach. He left early for work, kissed Clara on the top of her head, reminded her about her science project, and said nothing at all to me except that he might be home late. I told myself it was just another busy week for him, that he was burying himself in spreadsheets and meetings like always, but part of me wondered if he was staying late at all, or if he was somewhere else entirely, doing something I didn't know about. At school, the whispers had started. I caught 2 teachers glancing my way in the staff lounge before quickly looking back at their coffee mugs. One of them smiled too brightly when I walked past, the kind of smile that covers something unspoken, and my stomach clenched, even though I told myself they had no proof of anything. Damien had been texting less too, saying he was busy with work, but I could feel him pulling back in small ways. A shorter reply here, a cancelled plan there. I told myself it was nothing, that people go through phases, but the unease kept growing. That evening, Ethan came home on time for once, helped Clara with her homework, and made small talk about her upcoming field trip while I cooked dinner. He was polite, calm, not cold exactly, but detached in a way that made me feel like an extra at my own table. When Clara went upstairs to get ready for bed, I asked Ethan if something was wrong, if work was stressful, if he was upset with me about something. He said no, everything was fine, his voice so steady it felt rehearsed. I told Sophie about it later that night, pacing the kitchen while she listened over the phone. I said Ethan had been acting strange, that he was quieter than usual, that he looked like someone carrying a secret. She laughed and said maybe he was planning a surprise for our anniversary next month. I didn't tell her that his expression didn't look like someone planning anything romantic. It looked like someone who had already decided something. On Wednesday, I stayed late at school grading essays, or at least that was the plan. Damien had texted earlier saying he was tired, maybe we should skip meeting up for a while, and the words left me colder than I expected. I told myself he was just busy, that he wasn't pulling away because things were getting complicated, but when I drove past his apartment later, his car was there and the lights were on, and I kept driving without stopping because I suddenly didn't want to know who else might be inside. When I got home, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder open in front of him. He closed it as soon as I walked in, sliding it neatly under a stack of bills. I asked if it was work stuff, and he said yes, nothing important, the same calm tone as always. We ate dinner in near silence, Clara chatting about her field trip forms, while Ethan nodded in the right places, and I pushed food around my plate, feeling like there was a conversation happening in the house that I wasn't invited to hear. The next day, a parent at school stopped me in the hallway to ask if everything was okay at home. She said it kindly, with the concerned tone people use when they want information without asking directly. I told her everything was fine, why wouldn't it be, and she smiled in that same too bright way before walking off. That was when I realized the rumors had spread beyond the staff lounge, maybe beyond the neighborhood too, and my chest tightened, even as I told myself gossip didn't matter if Ethan wasn't listening to it. Except maybe he was. Friday afternoon, I saw his car parked outside Carter and Dean Law offices when I was driving home from school. I slowed down at the intersection, staring at the building until the car behind me honked, and then I kept driving with my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself he was probably there for tax advice or something to do with work, that it had nothing to do with me, but the unease that had been growing for weeks started spreading like cracks across glass. At dinner that night, he was polite again, calm again, asking Clara about her day, about her science project, about whether she was excited for the field trip next week. He didn't look at me when he spoke, not even when I asked about his day in return. He said work was busy, nothing unusual, then excused himself to his office after dinner and closed the door. I stood outside that door for a long time, listening to the faint murmur of his voice on the phone, too low to make out the words. When I asked later who he had been talking to, he said it was work stuff again, the same even tone, the same careful calm that gave me nothing at all. That weekend, Sophie came over and said someone she knew had mentioned seeing my car outside Damien's apartment more than once. She asked if there was something I wanted to tell her, her voice hesitant, like she already suspected the answer. I laughed too loudly, said people needed to stop inventing stories, but Sophie didn't laugh with me this time. She just nodded slowly and changed the subject, and I hated the uneasy silence that followed, more than if she had just asked the question directly. Sunday evening ended with Ethan helping Clara pack for her field trip, while I sat on the couch pretending to read, watching him move through the house like someone following a list I couldn't see. He wasn't angry, wasn't cold, wasn't anything I could point to and say was wrong. But something had shifted, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe Ethan wasn't ignoring the whispers after all. Maybe he was listening very carefully. By the time Clara left for her field trip Monday morning, Ethan had already disappeared for work before sunrise, leaving a note on the counter reminding her to call when she arrived. He didn't leave one for me. I told myself he was just busy, that it didn't mean anything, but the house felt hollow with only me in it, like he had taken all the noise and warmth with him. At school, the teachers in the lounge barely tried to hide their glances now. Someone had clearly told someone else something, because the whispers stopped when I walked in, followed by that too bright silence people use when they know more than they should. I grabbed my coffee, smiled, like I didn't notice, and told myself it didn't matter, because rumors couldn't actually hurt you if there was no proof. That evening, Sophie called asking if Ethan and I were okay, because she'd heard from Ruth that he looked exhausted at church Sunday, like he hadn't slept in days. I told her he was just working too much, that people love to exaggerate things, but my voice sounded thin even to me. She asked again if there was anything going on I hadn't told her about. I said no, of course not, and changed the subject to Clara's field trip so quickly it was obvious I didn't want to talk about Ethan at all. On Wednesday, Clara called after school, sounding excited, talking about the museum and the bus ride, and how Dad had texted her goodnight the night before. She asked why I hadn't, and I said I had been busy with work, even though the truth was I didn't know what to say when Ethan was talking to her, more than he was talking to me these days. That night, Ethan came home early for the first time in weeks. He ordered pizza for Clara, since she had just gotten back from her trip, listened to her stories about the planetarium, laughed at the part where she got lost in the gift shop and had to be rescued by a teacher. He was warm with her, completely himself, but he barely looked at me even when I joined the conversation. It was like I was furniture, something in the background he didn't have to acknowledge. After Clara went to bed, I asked him directly if he was angry with me. He said no, not angry, just thinking about things lately. I asked what things, but he only said we'd talk soon, that it wasn't the right time yet. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle, and for some reason, that scared me more than shouting would have. On Friday evening, we went to a birthday dinner for one of Ethan's cousins at a downtown restaurant. I thought maybe being out together would quiet the gossip, that people would see us side by side and stop whispering behind my back. But halfway through the meal, someone made a joke about how often my car was parked near Damien's apartment. It was said lightly, tossed out like harmless humor, but the table went quiet for a moment before the laughter picked back up. thin and strained. I laughed too, said small towns loved their stories, that people saw one thing and invented 3 more to go with it. But I felt the weight of every glance, every awkward smile, every shift in conversation that followed. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't defend me either. He just sat there with that same polite expression, drinking his water slowly, like he was waiting for someone else to say something first. Later, when dessert came, Ruth leaned across the table and asked Ethan if he was feeling okay, because he looked tired again. He said he was fine, just busy, and changed the subject to Clara's school projects, while I sat there feeling like the air itself had gotten heavier around us. After dinner, in the parking lot, Sophie asked quietly if I had heard what people were saying. I told her it was all gossip, nothing worth repeating, but she didn't look convinced. She said Ethan didn't deserve to be humiliated like this, that if there was nothing going on, I should make people stop talking before it got worse. I snapped that I wasn't responsible for what people chose to believe, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt the ground shifting under my feet. That night, Ethan put Clara to bed, kissed her forehead, told her he'd be up early for work again in the morning. When I asked if we could talk, he said not tonight, maybe this weekend, his voice still calm, still steady, giving nothing away. He went into his office and closed the door while I stood in the hallway staring at the wood grain, like it might tell me what he was doing in there every evening lately. Saturday morning, Clara went to Ruth's house to bake cookies, leaving Ethan and me alone for the first time in weeks. I thought maybe he would finally bring everything into the open, but instead he left after lunch saying he had errands. Hours later, driving to the grocery store, I saw his car parked outside Carter and Dean Law offices again. This time, there was no pretending it was about taxes or work. He was in there for a reason, and for the first time, I started to wonder if Ethan's calmness wasn't forgiveness at all. Maybe it was preparation. By Sunday evening, the house felt like 2 separate worlds under one roof. Ethan moved through his routines with the same calm precision as always, helping Clara with her homework, making sure the laundry was done, cooking dinner when I said I wasn't hungry, all while speaking to me only when necessary. He wasn't cruel or loud or even cold exactly. He was polite, distant, like a neighbor you barely knew, rather than the man I'd been married to for 12 years. I told myself he was punishing me with silence because he didn't have proof, that he was waiting for me to break first and admit to something I wasn't ready to confess. But part of me knew that wasn't it at all. On Monday, Sophie stopped by after work, setting her purse on the counter and giving me a look that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. She said people were still talking, that someone swore they had seen Damien and me at the bar together last week, even though I hadn't been there since the birthday dinner. I told her it was ridiculous, that people in this town made stories out of nothing. She didn't smile the way she used to when I brushed things off. She just asked if Ethan had said anything yet. I told her no, he was being impossible, shutting me out like I was the one with something to apologize for. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me for a long moment before saying, maybe I should be careful what I wished for, because once Ethan did start talking, I might not like what he had to say. That evening, Ruth called and asked if Clara could come over, after school the next day. Her voice was polite, but there was an edge to it, like she was trying very hard not to say something else. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she just thought Clara could use a change of scenery, that she missed having her around. It felt like more than that, like Ruth was taking sides without saying it out loud. Tuesday night, Ethan came home later than usual, still wearing his work clothes, his hair damp from the rain. He set a thick envelope on the counter next to my keys before going upstairs to change. I stared at it while water dripped from his coat onto the floor, my chest tight because I already knew it wasn't bills or tax forms. When he came back down, I asked what it was. He said it was for me, his voice even, calm, like we were talking about the weather. Inside were pages stamped with words like petition for separation, custody motion, asset protection order. My name was everywhere, the legal language sharp and final, even though I barely understood half of it. There was a hearing date listed 2 weeks from now. Temporary custody requests. Financial account freezes. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, like all the weeks of silence had been leading here, while I told myself he was just sulking. When I demanded to know what this was supposed to be, Ethan said it was exactly what it looked like. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He just said it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. I told him he was overreacting, that he was humiliating me over gossip, that he was letting other people's lies ruin our family. He said quietly that it wasn't about gossip, it was about choices, about evidence, about the kind of marriage Clara had been living in while I was too busy blaming everyone else for things I'd done myself. I called Sophie after he went to bed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told her Ethan was going to destroy everything, that he was turning Clara against me, that he was freezing the bank accounts, so I couldn't even pay bills without his permission. She was quiet for a long time before asking if there was any chance the rumors about Damien had been true. I said no, of course not, but my voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and Sophie didn't argue or agree. She just said maybe I should get a lawyer before things went any further. Wednesday morning, Ethan told Clara she'd be staying with Ruth and Daniel for the weekend because he had things to handle. He didn't ask me if I agreed. He just told me like it was already decided, like I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. Clara looked confused but didn't say anything, just nodded slowly before packing a bag after school. Like this was normal now, like going to her grandparents' house without me was just another routine we were all supposed to accept. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope while Ethan worked in his office with the door closed. I told myself he was bluffing, that he wouldn't actually go through with it, that he was too calm to be serious, but deep down I knew he wasn't bluffing at all. He had been planning this for weeks while I was busy pretending nothing was wrong, and now the plan had a court date stamped at the top of the page to prove it. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and Ethan moving through the house like a man checking off boxes on a list I couldn't see. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice or even argue when I demanded to talk. He just kept organizing documents, answering calls behind the closed door of his office, and making sure Clara got to school on time before dropping her at Ruth's for the weekend, as if nothing about this was unusual. On Friday morning, another envelope arrived by courier with copies of motions Ethan had already filed: temporary custody, financial account restrictions, preliminary property division requests. My name was everywhere in those pages, typed in neat black ink beside words like petitioner and respondent, like we were strangers on opposite sides of a contract instead of people who had shared a home for over a decade. That afternoon, I finally managed to corner Ethan in the kitchen while Clara was at Ruth's house. I asked him if he was really going through with this, if he understood what it would do to Clara, to our family, to me. He said calmly that Clara would be fine, because she deserved stability, that the family had already taken sides, that as for me, the court would decide soon enough. His voice never rose, not once, but there was something in the way he spoke that made my chest tighten like the walls were closing in. On Saturday, Sophie came over after hearing from Ruth about the custody motion. She asked if it was true Ethan was trying to get primary custody. When I told her yes, she looked at me for a long time before asking if there was anything I hadn't told her. I said no, that Ethan was overreacting, that this was about his pride, not about Clara, not about the marriage. Sophie didn't argue this time. She just told me to find a lawyer before the hearing, because Ethan wasn't playing games anymore. Monday morning, I sat in a law office across from a woman in a grey suit who flipped through the documents Ethan had filed. She explained the terms in a steady, professional tone. Temporary custody hearing in 2 weeks. Asset freeze already approved by the court. Ethan requesting the house so Clara wouldn't have to move after the separation. I told the lawyer Ethan was using gossip and rumors to punish me, that none of this proved I was a bad mother. She asked if the rumors were true. I said no, of course not, but my voice sounded too quick, too defensive, even to me. That evening, Ethan came home early to make dinner for Clara while I sat in the living room pretending to read. He laughed at something she said about school, asked about her homework, told her they'd go to the park after the hearing next week because things might be different after that. I felt the words land like a door closing, because he wasn't talking about the future like it was ours anymore. On Wednesday, the preliminary financial orders came through. The joint checking account was frozen, leaving me with only the small savings account in my name. Credit cards locked. Mortgage payments temporarily assigned to Ethan alone until the court decided who would keep the house. I told Sophie on the phone that Ethan was cutting me off on purpose, trying to make me look desperate before the hearing. She asked again if there was anything I wasn't admitting. I said no, that he was twisting things to ruin my reputation. She didn't respond right away, and the silence between us felt heavier than words. Friday morning, Ethan dropped Clara at Ruth's again, before spending the day at Carter and Dean law offices. I drove past once, saw his car in the parking lot, thought about going inside to demand answers, but I didn't. I kept driving, hands tight on the steering wheel, telling myself he was bluffing, even as every piece of paper said otherwise. That evening, more documents arrived, schedules for visitation, preliminary orders about child support calculations, even instructions about dividing furniture if the house was awarded to one of us after the final hearing. Ethan set the envelope on the counter before taking Clara upstairs to read to her, moving through the house like a man following a plan that was already too far along to stop. On Sunday, I overheard Clara asking Ethan if she would have to change schools after the hearing. He told her no, she would stay in the same house, the same room, the same school. She asked if I would stay too, and he said gently that the judge would decide what was best for everyone. He said it with the same calm voice he'd used for weeks, the same voice that had stopped sounding like peace and started sounding like the end of everything. By Monday morning, the court date was only a week away, and Ethan was still gathering documents in his office while I sat in the kitchen, staring at the envelope listing visitation schedules, like I didn't recognize my own life anymore. The day of the hearing arrived with grey skies and a wind that rattled the courthouse windows, as if the weather itself knew what was coming. Ethan was already there when I walked in, sitting with his lawyer at the long wooden table, a black folder in front of him, stacked with the documents he had been collecting for weeks. He didn't look at me when I sat down with my own lawyer, didn't greet me, didn't speak at all. It was like I was just another person in the room, not the woman he had shared a life with for over a decade. The judge began by reviewing the motions Ethan had filed, the temporary custody request, the asset protection order, the financial statements showing which accounts had been frozen, the list of property he claimed should stay with him for Clara's stability. My lawyer tried to object, saying the rumors that led to all this were exaggerated, but the judge said the documents spoke for themselves and kept reading in that flat, steady voice that made my stomach twist tighter with every page. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was calm and even, the same voice he had used at home for weeks, the same voice I had once mistaken for patience before realizing it was strategy. He told the judge Clara needed one stable home, that moving her back and forth between parents would disrupt her schooling and her life, that the house should stay with the parent who had primary custody so she wouldn't have to change neighborhoods or classrooms or routines. He said the accounts should be divided according to the prenup we had signed years ago, the one I had forgotten even existed, because I never thought it would matter. He didn't accuse me directly of anything, didn't raise his voice or point fingers, but every word he spoke landed like a weight sliding into place on a scale already tipping in his favor. When it was my turn, I told the judge the rumors had been twisted, that people in small towns like to invent stories, that Ethan was using gossip to punish me for things that weren't true. I said I was a good mother, that Clara needed me as much as she needed him, that freezing the accounts was unnecessary and unfair. But even as I said it, I could hear how thin my words sounded, next to the steady rhythm of Ethan's evidence, the timelines, the bank records, the witness statements from people who claimed they had seen my car outside Damien's apartment more than once. My lawyer tried to argue that none of it proved what Ethan wanted it to prove, but the judge kept asking about dates and times, and why Ethan had been living in the guest room for weeks, if everything at home was fine like I claimed. I didn't have good answers, not ones that mattered. The ruling came that afternoon, the judge reading it in the same even tone as if it were any other case, not the end of a marriage I had thought would survive anything. Primary custody of Clara to Ethan, the house awarded to him so she could stay in the same school, the same bedroom, the same neighborhood. Financial accounts divided under the prenup terms, leaving me with far less than I expected because Ethan had kept most of the savings in his name all along. Visitation schedules for me on alternating weekends and certain holidays, printed neatly on the last page like a calendar someone else had filled in for my life. Ethan thanked the judge, shook his lawyer's hand, and began gathering his documents while I sat there, holding my copy of the order, the black letters sharp against the white paper, the finality of it pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. He didn't look at me as he left the courtroom. Ruth and Daniel were waiting in the hallway with Clara, who held a small overnight bag and looked confused but not surprised, like she had already understood what was happening before I did. She hugged Ethan first, clinging to his side, then gave me a quick, awkward hug, like she wasn't sure what she was supposed to feel. Ethan told her gently they were going home now, that he would make her favorite dinner, that she could set up her school project in the living room tonight because there was more space there. He spoke to her with warmth in his voice, the kind I hadn't heard directed at me in weeks. I wanted to tell her this wasn't the end, that things would go back to normal, that I would fix everything, but the words stuck in my throat because even I didn't believe them anymore. Ethan opened the car door for her, put her bag in the back seat, thanked his parents for waiting, then drove away without looking back. I stood there on the courthouse steps holding the folder the clerk had given me, pages of custody rulings and property divisions fluttering in the wind, realizing Ethan had done it all without shouting, without slamming a single door, without giving me any chance to spin the story in my favor. He had taken Clara, the house, the savings, the future I thought was still mine, and left me standing there with nothing but a stack of papers that said it was already over. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.